Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and so I'm going to take a step back from the avalanche of Tory scandals just for a moment and take a look at the consequences of the avalanche of Tory scandals, because this latest poll doesn't just show that the Tories are in trouble. They all show that, let's be honest. It shows that they're now in a position where they just probably can't do anything about it. No more last chance saloon, no more plans, no more strategies. They're done for. IPSOS have published a new voting intention poll today. Now, along with YouGov, they are one of the top two pollsters who have been much more accurate than the rest when put to the test of real elections. But they are also notable for having been the only major pollster not to appear to inflate Reform UK's vote share. So when they show that it has climbed up to 13% now, the Tories ought to sit up and take notice. And the other headline result was the Conservatives on 19%. This is the lowest vote share that IPSOS have ever recorded for the Conservative Party. And what makes this especially shocking, they've been polling since 1978. You plug this into the MRP calculator on electoral calculus, you get Labour on 513 seats, the Tories on 37, and the Lib Dems on 49. Now, if these results were translated into the actual general election results, the Conservatives would not even lead the opposition. In fact, they'd be so close to extinction, I'd half expect the WWF to send me a letter asking for donations. Now, using an MRP calculator, of course, with just a bog standard poll using a sample of a bit over 1,000 people, is going to be very rough and ready. Don't confuse these supposed predictions with an actual forecast for what would happen exactly. But it won't be ridiculously far off the mark either. Why this poll is important is that the Conservatives have been going full steam ahead with their campaign mode right from the start of this year. It was not all that long ago that CCHQ had to temporarily close down. They couldn't even afford the cleaners because the Tories were struggling for funds. So they shut their own headquarters down for a bit to save money. That's how bad they were. Now, the entire place is heaving with the party's election strategist Isaac Levidow has been in charge of campaigning on a full-time day-to-day basis since the 1st of January. Now, why does this matter? Because everyone is looking for signs that the polls may narrow ahead of the general election later this year. There are only two credible ways in which the polls narrow. The first is that people who have tended to vote Conservative in the past but are not indicating that they're going to do so this time, come the election, change their mind. The don't knows hold their nose and vote Tory as somehow being better than Starmer's Labour. Those saying they will vote Reform UK decide to vote strategically for what they think is the better option. This is still possible. We won't really know whether it's going to happen or not until the election itself. But what polling can tell us is there's not that many of those people available. But the second cause would be the Conservative campaign doing something to actively change people's minds and change their voting intention. But look at how 2024 has gone so far. Full campaign mode from the Tories, absolutely full campaign mode. Huge sums of money spent on social media advertising, 2 rounds of tax cuts, and we're only just into the second quarter with more promised later on this year. And yet, not only have the polls not narrowed, but things are actually a little worse for the Tories. Like YouGov have produced 2 large-scale MRP polls, and the second was significantly worse for the Tories. In terms of the more regular but smaller sampled polls, the situation is also slightly worse. The poll gap between the Conservatives and Labour is much the same. You know, it tends to vary by a point or two, but it's essentially the same. It's pretty close to the same throughout. It's static. So looking purely in terms of the poll gap, you could be forgiven for thinking that this full-blooded and presumably expensive full campaign mode for the Tories hasn't actually improved things for them. But that would be a charitable reading of the poll data, because the poll gap doesn't tell the whole story. In a first past the post system like ours, it doesn't matter what share of the vote the Tories or Labour get. It's largely irrelevant. What matters is who gets the most votes in 650 individual different constituencies. That poll gap can remain exactly the same as it has been doing, and things can still get worse for the Tories. And reason number one is Reform UK. Reform UK's polling has jumped up by several points in the first few months of 2024. That's a significant escalation. And not just with one or two pollsters. I'm not just saying it's done it with the more credible pollsters. It's across the board. You know, different pollsters disagree as to what that vote share is, but they all agree it has gone up significantly in the last few months. It is likely that Reform UK have got a ceiling of realistic support, partly because they only appeal to a certain type of voter, and partly because even some of those voters will vote tactically for a realistic candidate, which is not going to be the Reform UK candidate. But whatever that ceiling of support is for Reform UK, it's quite likely they haven't quite reached it yet in the polls. And so even without the poll gap with Labour changing very much up or down, things can still look worse for the Tories in a few months' time in terms of MRP results. And then there's the under the bonnet results. When Rishi Sunak became leader of his party, it was vital that he establish himself as clearly superior to Truss and Johnson. He had that opportunity. Even given the fractious nature of his party, there were things he could do to stand a little taller than his predecessors. Didn't take much, just a little taller than a snake's belly. But he hasn't even managed that in terms of public approval. Things got bad for Sunak when he achieved a lower approval rating than Boris Johnson. That instantly invited attacks from Johnson supporters. Up until then, Sunak supporters could claim that the public preferred Sunak. All Johnson supporters could do was say he would have recovered his reputation. He wouldn't have done. But that's all they could do. The Sunak supporters say Sunak's clearly preferred by the public. Once that was no longer the case, he was in real trouble. Now he's managed to get an approval rating even lower than that of Liz Truss. Basically curtains at this point, isn't it? Sunak has the lowest approval rating of any Prime Minister, going right back to Margaret Thatcher. Nobody else has managed to plumb such depths. And this creates two problems for the Tories. The first is that they are essentially sticking by the most unpopular Prime Minister for at least 45 years in election year. Now, if it weren't for other circumstances which might mean making things worse by changing him, as I'll go over in a moment, this would not be strategically wise. You would get rid of him. And the second thing is that it just gives opponents within the Conservative Party ammunition to use against him. The party will continue to brief against itself, and voters will continue to see a deeply divided party. On the head-to-head between leaders, Starmer leads on almost everything. Sunak is just shading it in terms of has a lot of personality. A little bit grim, but there you go. And is tied on good in a crisis. Sunak is even losing on the patriotism stakes, usually the bread and butter for a Conservative leader. He obviously doesn't have enough flags. And one section of the poll shows why the Tories would probably be poorly advised to replace Sunak. Yes, he's the most unpopular Prime Minister for generations. Yes, normal political wisdom is you throw him out the airlock and get someone else in. But this latest poll shows that most of the realistic alternatives are seen as even worse. So it's not just that replacing Sunak would be replacing your leader 3 times in one parliament and that just looks clown-like. It's that the alternatives are worse. Replacing him would almost certainly result in a boost to Starmer and Labour, not the Conservatives. Penny Mordaunt is showing better figures, but only just. Probably not enough of a boost to justify the damage that another messy leadership contest would inflict, and I suspect the leadership contest would be messy. So the story of this poll is one of the Tories being cornered and broken. They have a strategy which is actively making things worse. Because consider this, at the point at which their campaign machine fired up to full steam, Reform UK escalated their appeal. So it's like their strategy is actively feeding Reform UK. They have a leader who is just sinking further and further into the mud. The party doesn't have a credible alternative as they did in 2019. And so it's not even like they can just collectively take charge and turn their fortunes around. And the polling right now is so bad that even a bit of a bounce, a significant bounce, would not save them from what is probably going to be their worst result in their 200-year-old history and by some margin. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.